So hello everyone, my name is Julia Chacon and I will be leading the carbon fluxes group together with Joseph Gauder. So the purpose of this talk is to understand the theoretical basis that allow us to link traits to ecosystem properties and in particular to carbon fluxes. Let's start. So let's start understanding why a trait-based approach is important or can help us to understand ecosystem level dynamics. Ecosystems around the world are changing, and these changes are driven by both natural and also due to human dynamics and activities. Some of the changes are driven by a strong increase in carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere. Indeed, carbon dioxide levels have increased from about 300 parts per million in the 60s towards about more than 400 parts per million in 2020. There are many reasons why carbon dioxide levels matter. One of them is because carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. So the higher the carbon dioxide levels are in the atmosphere, the higher the greenhouse effect becomes. And due to this increase, the temperatures on Earth are rising, as you can see here, and as you all know. Functional traits of individuals shape individuals' growth and reproduction in a given environment, and then are key to understanding organismal responses to environmental shifts or to climate change. For example, here we have an environmental change that goes from the environment 1 towards the environment 3. And that is apparently driving a taxonomic, but also a functional turnover from these forests on the left towards these forests here on the right, dominated by conifers. So traits do not only affect individual performance, they also drive various ecosystem properties like biomass production or pollination, and of course, all the services that these properties provide to human well-being. So functional trait or functional ecology, functional trait-based ecology approaches want to understand the patterns of individual trait responses to the environment, how these responses affect individual performance and communities, and also the mechanisms by which functional diversity affects ecosystem properties that are relevant to the ecosystem services. We already know what a functional trait is because you have already listened to many other talks before. We can understand a functional trait as a surrogate of organismal performance. But to jump from traits of individuals to ecosystem functioning, we need to understand what variation in functional traits is reflecting. What's the meaning of this variation in functional traits? So the persistence of an individual at a given environment or at a given site depends on how this individual is managing resources. That means how this individual acquires resources, how this individual conserves, and how it loses resources over time. How an individual manages resources depends on its traits values. So variation in traits is basically reflecting different ecological strategies that maximize resource management or maximize organismal performance and fitness in a given site or under given environmental conditions. Let's use a very easy to understand example. Photosynthesis provides carbon and energy to plants and drive most ecological processes or most of the biological processes in ecosystems. Photosynthesis at the same time depends on green leaves. So the functioning of green leaves is crucial for resource management because green leaves are going to set the rate of are going to set the rate of plant carbon acquisition through photosynthesis and are going to set the rate of ecosystem carbon acquisition. Under different environments, plants are going to show different types of leaves, reflecting different ecological strategies that also translate into different rates of plant carbon acquisition and different rates of ecosystem carbon acquisition too. So let's use SLA as an example. Here you can see three-way relationships between three fundamental traits of the leaf economic spectrum. On the left, we have Amax, or maximum rate of photosynthesis per unit of leaf mass. On the right, we have leaf lifespan in months. And here at the bottom, we have SLA, the specific leaf area that, as you already know, is the ratio between leaf mass, the ratio between leaf area and leaf mass. So here we find a negative relationship between maximum photosynthetic rate and leaf lifespan. That means that leaf longevity is very short when leaf photosynthetic rate is very high. There is also a negative correlation between SLA and leaf lifespan. This negative correlation suggests that leaves that have very long lifespan require high structural strength. They show a low SLA. Lower SLA values means that these leaves has done a great investment on a structure, on a structural strength. So leaves that have a very short leaf longevity also show a lower investment on the construction of the leaf, or we can see that from the opposite side. So those leaves that have a very long lifespan have invested more resources on the construction of the leaf. Finally, there is a positive relationship between SLA and maximum photosynthetic rate. That means that leaves with high SLA value tend to have high photosynthetic capacity per unit of leaf mass. Higher SLA corresponds to more light intercepted per unit mass, which generally co-varies with higher leaf nitrogen concentration, reflecting also higher concentration of rubisco and other photosynthetic proteins in the leaf. I'm using SLA as an example because SLA is a widely used trait and also a widely used trait to estimate the position of a species along an acquisition and conservation continuum. SLA here is telling us something about ecological strategies for carbon gain and turnover. It's a measure of investment strategy. And of course, SLA here is telling us something about ecosystem functioning. So these trade-offs between resource acquisitive and conservative strategies are known as the slow-fast continuum or slow-fast spectrum. On one end of this spectrum, we have species that grow very quickly. These species are characterized by a suite of traits that correspond with fast growth strategies. Typically, species at this end of the spectrum have very thin tissues. They don't allocate a lot of resources to leaf construction or to leaf mass, so they tend to show high SLA values. They have higher concentration of nitrogen in order to increase also photosynthetic rates that allow assimilating carbon as much as carbon to support rapid growth. On the other side of the spectrum, we have slow growing plants or slow growth strategies, like for example, perennials or woody species. These kind of species tend to have the opposite suite of traits. So they tend to show more robust tissues that they retain for longer periods of time. And instead of focusing on acquire resources very quickly, these plants tend to use resources more conservatively. And of course, there are a lot of plants or a lot of species in between these two ends of the spectrum. The effects of organisms or the effect of organism traits on ecosystem properties are represented here with these big arrows. Okay. And of course, this can feed back to the species present on an ecosystem, but let's focus on these big arrows. Communities dominated by slow growth plants or dominated by plants with slow growth strategies are communities also that are going to be very good at storing carbon. Over time, they are going to have low ecosystem productivity and also tend to accumulate litter over time and to have lower turnover rates. On the other side of the spectrum, those communities with plants with fast growth strategies are going to be highly productive communities. They are going to have high litter decomposition rates and also high rates of carbon capture and loss. So as you can see here, the type of strategies that plants sow in an ecosystem are going to affect directly or are going to scale up directly to affect ecosystem processes. So summarizing, there are a set of mechanistic steps that allow us scaling from traits to ecosystems. And I just want to summarize them. Traits are going to affect the performance of individuals. Trait differences are also going to drive variation in individual fitness in a given environment. So differences also in trait values are going to drive differences in relative abundances of individuals at a given environment. And this is going to be defined by a trait frequency distribution that impacts community level properties like community weighted mass. Yeah, community weighted means, sorry. So here below these trees, you can see the trait frequency distribution of different forests. And finally, the shape of this community trait frequency distribution is going to impact ecosystem level properties, like, for example, net ecosystem productivity. That is the example that I'm using here, together with LMA, that is the inverse of the SLA. Because traits are often linked to metabolism, the rates of fluxes and pools of energy and resources in a community are going to depend partly on the frequency distribution of trait values in a community. And this is going to depend largely on the variation of traits of the dominant species in that community, or on those species that have higher biomass on the community. This is known as the grain mass ratio hypothesis. All these things that I'm explaining here correspond to a classical scaling exercise that assumes that the traits of individuals can be used to predict individual performance and fitness, and ultimately or finally scale up to affect ecosystem functioning directly. However, there are other ways traits can affect ecosystem processes in a non-additive manner. We know that changes in a species richness, and this apparently has nothing to do with traits, but you will see, have been linked to changes in ecosystem functioning, in particular to increases in productivity. The biodiversity ecosystem functioning hypothesis states that ecosystems with greater biodiversity or with greater species richness are more productive. In this, there is general consensus on this relationship. However, there is also consensus that it's not only the number of species what is important for ecosystem productivity, because as the number of species increases in a community, also trait diversity increases in this community. So diverse communities are generally more productive because they contain key species or key combination of species or functional traits that have a large impact on productivity. Okay, so the dominance of certain species with particular traits that have a strong impact on productivity are going to be more likely to appear in a very diverse community. But also, more diverse communities also show higher complementarity in resource use, because there are going to be different species with different type of traits or different trait values that allow acquiring resources in a complementarity manner. And that will also influence the functioning of the ecosystem. These two mechanisms are the basis of the relationships between functional diversity or between diversity and functional diversity and ecosystem functioning, in particular productivity. And finally, let's connect all these with the carbon fluxes pools. Here you can see the major factors governing variation in gross primary productivity, also known as GPP, in an ecosystem. GPP is basically the photosynthesis at the ecosystem level. So if you want to know better about the pools of the carbon fluxes, or the carbon fluxes pools, you can listen to the talk by Joseph Gauder, who is going to explain better all these pools, and he's going to explain better what GPP means. But for now, photosynthesis is the process, as we have already seen, by which most of the carbon enters the ecosystem. The factors that are controlling photosynthesis at the cellular and at the leaf level are the availability of photosynthetic reactants or resources. So these resources are carbon dioxide, the energy from light, and also the temperature and the availability of nitrogen in the system, because nitrogen is required to produce photosynthetic proteins. So like photosynthesis, the variation in gross primary productivity, that is photosynthesis at the ecosystem level, is going to be governed or driven by the same abiotic factors, right? Also by the season length. However, GPP is also going to be determined by the amount of photosynthetic tissue that is available in the system. So that means that there is also a biotic component governing variation in GPP. For example, higher leaf area implies higher photosynthetic surface that is going to affect or to produce higher gross primary productivity. Similarly, leaves with higher nitrogen levels also have larger photosynthetic machinery. All these connect to the slow fast spectrum that I have explained before. So for those interested in understanding better the pools of carbon fluxes, I recommend listening to Joseph's talk. And of course, I strongly recommend reading the chapter 6 from this book here. So thank you so much for listening. See you soon in Norway. Let's discuss about this talk, and hopefully I can also show you in person some results from my work, linking traits to carbon fluxes. Probably I will try to give this talk in the course in person in July. So bye-bye, nice to meet you. See you.